Okay, so I have an empty house. I remember when I was single, before I met my wife, I had a flat, and my worst nightmare at the time would be having nothing to do, or just being in my flat without anything to do, boredom. There was like a restlessness, but at the same time an apathy, just a constant discontentment, because I felt like I constantly needed to confirm my existence by doing things, by action, by being occupied with something, or maybe moving towards something. I definitely couldn't just sit. I definitely couldn't at that point just sit and exist peacefully. But now it's different. So one of my favourite things to do is just to sit. So I wanted to talk about thought. So this is probably one that I could spend all day talking about. Um, One of the big insights, let's say, for me, was the resistance to a thought, or the labeling or categorizing thought as something bad, which was, of course, again, reifying an identity that relates to the thoughts, that wants to avoid thoughts or change the thought space. That was just another thought. So if you're trying to avoid thought, that's a thought. Which is when it becomes very kind of paradoxical for the mind, that it doesn't know how to stop itself. As in, the thoughts just appear. They're uncaused by anything. Well, at least they're uncaused by a subject that the thoughts refer to, a thinker. To that they're uncaused, but I guess you could say that the cause for thought is a mystery. But thought is a mystery itself. It's always appears presently, always appears in this moment. The content might refer to something in the future or in the past, or theoretical, something that's not this present moment. But the thought itself always appears now, along with that which the thought refers to, who the thought is owned by, the thinker. And for those watching who have recognized that that thinker isn't there other than another thought, you can maybe explore something which I mentioned frequently in the previous videos. I mentioned that there seem to be levels of thought, layers of thought. Although I've said before that in a sense, every thought is the same thought, is the one thought, because it appears as a thought now. And it's more of the thinker is more of a function thought, a thought function. So that content that the thinker thinks about, when, let's say, viewed from that point of view of the thinker, overlooks and assumes the existence of the thinker. So for example, very simple, if I say I'm having a thought, then already it's assumed that the thought belongs to the thinker, that I am having a thought. Something like maybe I had an awakening experience, maybe framed in time. I had an awakening experience, but then I lost it. All looks out from the point of view of the one that it refers to, the one that this experience is happening to, belongs to. It's just assumed that it's there. It's just assumed that the thinker, the one who relates to this experience, exists. Looking from that position, you can't really see it. You can't really see it for what it is, because you're looking from it. That's maybe why you hear a lot about turning the attention around, not looking out at the objective thought world. It kind of seems like I'm in back here thinking about stuff that might be out there, turning that around and looking, what are the thoughts referring to? Who thinks these thoughts? Where do they come from? Because they're all talking about something as they relate to a me, as they relate to a me who thinks about this, me who likes this, me who wants to avoid this. I want to pursue this. I'm having this experience. I'm having that experience. And it's not in the words. It's not in the language. It's not in the specifics. It's the whole movement of it. It seems to be the movement. It just feels real. It feels like this is my experience. I am trying to wake up. I am seeking. It's almost like the deeper level of thought is more of a feeling that the specifics are based on. Like I say a lot, the closest I've been able to get to describing it is an assumption that feels real. An energetic assumption, just a given, this is me and I think. But we can't find that one other than mixed up with the thoughts, suggested in the thoughts. It's not even a real thing made of thought, it's just suggested in the thought. Suggested in that function, in that process of thinking. But when we look, it's just not there. But then we find something that is there, and it's not what we thought it was. It's not this assumed separate me. For some people, it is what feels like me. But infinite, but without borders, without time, without content, but within which all that appears. And then we'll use words for it like presence, I amness, isness, thisness, oneness, awareness, awakeness, so on and so on, knowingness. One that resonated for me was the knowingness. The knowingness in which, or the knowing awareness in which all of this appears, unchanged by anything, the appearance, always there, without which nothing exists. That which is here, always, that which can't be removed from experience. And we see that the separate self, the narrative, time-based mind self, can be removed from experience and sometimes isn't present in experience, is only seemingly present in experience when we're thinking, when we're looking from that and just assuming it's there. So like I mentioned, the layers of thought, there seem to be layers, levels of thought. So you have like, initially I had this overt narrative that was capturing all of my attention, that was talking about, giving me stories about, all from a point of me, all from a separate position, relating outwardly to experience. But it felt like it was in here. It felt like it was my world in here, my internal world of relating to things through the medium of thought. And it was running all the time. And that faded away with that recognition I talked about at the start. When I saw that it was repetitive, it was automatic, the thoughts, they weren't caused by an entity here that was a conscious, autonomous agent. They just happened. I didn't have any control over them, and they didn't refer to anything. When that illusion of the mind narrative self was broken, then the thought in that way continued as a pattern for a good while. But at the same time, I fully understood, let's say it was clear that I couldn't do anything about that. There was no me here that was the owner of that pattern, that pattern played out without anyone here that it referred to, or at least without the belief in a real thing here that it referred to. And as that gradually quieted down, as the thoughts became less of a problem, as that attachment, that identification was kind of severed, it uncovered a whole different world of thought that lay beneath the obvious mind narrative. And that seemed to be, that thought, I could describe it as less formed into an objective linguistic content or symbolic content in terms of form, in terms of language, in terms of images. More like the emotion became apparent, that, and I saw a connection between, I say I saw a connection between, but limits of language. It was clear that there was an emotion that seemed to just, was apparently triggered by the circumstances of this life, of this moving through this environment. But as the narrative didn't connect that anymore, there was just emotion that just came uncaused. There was a seeming connection to that from that emotional movement, that emotional pattern, to a narrative of thought. The thoughts didn't go fully into a narrative that formed into a whole world, internal world in here. You could kind of see a not fully formed thought that because it didn't spring up into a full-blown internal world, it was more of just like a movement, a feeling movement, an energetic movement around of, like, I guess you could say, vague, blunted thoughts mixed up with emotions. And it all just became a pattern that was happening now, rather than something that had a clear form. As this was happening, then, as these emotions came up, it was clear that there was no logical escape route, no conceptual narrative solution to the emotions. So that's when I described that I was getting a lot of physical symptoms as well, because the awareness of sensory experience of this body became more in the forefront of experience, because there wasn't this kind of unconsciousness, this stepping out of this immediate physical reality, this sensory experience into a thought narrative. That escapism wasn't quite there anymore, to the degree that it was before. So then I became aware of this more, the movement of the kind of, let's say, biological fluctuations of this seeming physical body. So the emotions were more intense, the aches and pains were intense. Turns out they were seemingly something about the thoughts, something about the thought narratives seemed to have a causal link in some way to the manifestation of physical pain, or at least that it was suppressing it or something like that. But I noticed that after a certain point, when the narrative at points was more sticky, when it came back with a bit more reality, it would immediately trigger physical pain symptoms like neck pain, upper back pain, headaches, stuff like that, which is very strange. It immediately seemed to have a link to physical pain, which I found bizarre, but also was easier to spot when the narratives came back, because it came coupled with physical pain. So different levels of thought. So there was the assumption of me, but then there was also, I tried to explain this before, and there's no good way I can really explain it, but there was a different type of narrative that wasn't talking in the mind, that didn't have form, but had emotional momentum. So you imagine that you hear a song that you associate with a certain time, or taste a taste, or smell a smell, and it gives you, let's say, a memory. Underneath that memory, there's a feeling, like a flavour, an emotional flavour. If anyone knows what I'm talking about with this, so that you hear a song like, oh, that reminds me of this time, and you get the feeling of it. That feeling was more clear, and it appeared to be everywhere. So anything that I looked at, anything that I heard, anything in this immediate physical reality, let's say, there were all these flavours, these that weren't necessarily linked to memories, let's say, from this personal self, from this lifetime. But there was definitely something there tying everything together into a kind of emotional narrative, if that makes any sense. And I talked about this in the video I made called The Eternal Witness Doesn't Exist, and I called it the emotional flavour of the witness, the emotional flavour of the the ultimate self, the ultimate I, the ultimate me. But that was just self. That was just separate self. That was a point of view. That was an interpretation, albeit a subtle one. The sense of I, the sense of the omniscient observer, lurking behind form, that all form maybe dissolves into, this emotional narrative that gives experience, continuity, and emotional content. If that makes any sense. So then there's a different type of thought that isn't like a concept, that isn't a story. It's what I attempt to talk about when I'm talking about the no separation, zero distance, non-dual. What I noticed was, I remember I was in the shower and I was washing my hair like that with my eyes closed, and I realised that there were sensations, but also there was an image, a mind image that was creating a mind representation of what was happening, a symbolic representation of those sensations as me washing my hair, vaguely my face, my hair, the sounds, me being in a room. All of that was kind of tied together in a kind of a mental imprint that was following experience, following along with the sensations. It's very difficult to explain this, but when I try and talk about the tracers, the mind tracers, so when I was walking home from work, I would be aware of the sensation of my foot stepping on the ground, but I noticed a tracer, an anticipation, let's say image in the mind, representation of what this was going to feel like as my foot was about to hit the ground, and then what it felt like after my foot left the ground, what the sensation felt like. Where am I going with this? When my foot was on the ground, once it lifted, there was still a kind of a mind tracer lagging behind. So there was a mental image of everything, trying to make sense of constantly all of these sensations and link them into a subtle narrative of time. So I noticed as well that when I looked at something, sometimes more than others, I would look away and I would still have the image of, say, this washing machine over there, or wherever that is, dryer. I'd look away and I'd still have a quick image that disappeared straight away in my mind. If I looked at it and closed my eyes, then the image would be there for a split second after I closed my eyes before it, the attention settled in the blackness behind the eyes. So there would also be an anticipation. So if I knew what I was going to look at before I turned my head to look at it, the image would already be there. This isn't accessible, I would say, if you're still in a mind narrative. This isn't even this isn't obvious at all. If there is a narrative playing out, taking attention away from immediate experience in the head. It was the same with sounds. So the mind would create a replica of the sounds, its own interpretation of the sounds. Let's say from the same substance of thought, imagination is made of, and it would run along with the sound to give it form, to give it an identity, to give it an objective quality, to say that sound is coming from this thing. The mind immediately going out to it and trying to make sense of that. And I noticed this happening. And as soon as I noticed it happening, something else about the sensory experience became clear. That the mind was overlaying its own interpretation of what this is, always and everything on top of the actual reality. And it gives it solidity, it gives it shape, form, separation. So if I look at an object and I see an object, I'm seeing the mind saying that's an object. I'm not actually seeing an object. What I'm seeing is, let's say, for example, one unified field of consciousness or awareness, presence, knowingness. The mind says there are objects. An object is a thought. But I also noticed that that was only possible, made possible, from this subtle point of view. The idea that I'm here looking at that thing over there is assumed when I pick that up as an object, or when the mind picks that up as an object. So that continues to function, but once it's been, that continued to function for me for the most part, but once it's been seen, it can also be dropped. It can also be dropped. So so then let's say it becomes clear in a way which I can't describe, that what you're looking at isn't a world of objects, and there's no you looking. That what you're hearing isn't an object or something, say a bird flying by out there. It's just sound, indescribable, unknowable, mysterious, whatever the fuck that is, sound. And this is when the mind can't even follow along anymore, because it's reached its limit, it's past the limit of the mind. But there is something obviously there, past that limit. But when that limit is, when the specifications of that limit are still a belief, are still assumed to be real, then that's all you see. So all I was seeing was the mind's version of this world, not what was actually there. All I was hearing was the mind's version of this world, not what was actually, not the sound. It was the mind's version of the sound. Although the sound is always present, the assumption stopped at the mind's version of it. And this came for me with the most profound, let's say, Dark Night of the Soul stuff. So dramatic. Because I was then losing the continuity, losing the space, the stability, the reliability of the mind's ability to create the illusion of controlling this experience, of owning it. And when that starts to drop away, it's a different type of terror. It was a different type of terror, that because that illusion of control was gone, and then the interpretation of that from that point of from that subtle position is very disturbing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but so if anyone is practicing this and they're getting an existential terror, that's there because there's a you holding on to a position, to try and have stability and figuring things out. Just come back to this. You don't have to figure it out. That's going to cause an uncomfortable experience. It helped me to know that. And the ability to function in life, in the mind's version of life, persists effortlessly. It's not like you lose that. It's not like that disappears. I can promise you that life goes on because it was always that way, because that was an illusion. There can be adaptations that are needed. So for example, my memory isn't very good. It's probably an understatement, but because there's not a constant reminding narrative that's talking its way through life anymore, the memory tends to go, if that makes sense. Lists are good, calendar reminders are good, phones. So it can be difficult to be involved socially in a narrative theme, let's say in conversation and relating, because it doesn't hold any reality. So that can be a little bit different. And I think things to look out for are the feeling, the emotion, the feeling is very important, because this can all get really heady very quickly when there's identification with thought. But if you move straight into the body immediately in this present moment, in a way that can kind of bypass a lot of the mind stuff. So that seeking feeling, that striving, even though it might be framed in a spiritual context and an awakening context, is the same function that we've been doing before, let's say, we got into this. And there's a feeling to it. It feels a certain way. It feels uncomfortable. It feels restless. It feels uncertain. It feels like it needs to conclude something quickly. But the thoughts will take you away from that feeling and rationalize it. And then the feeling kind of goes into the background. Just stop the mind. Or let's say it seems like you take attention away from the mind, put it into the feeling, the body, where it is in the body. It might not even feel like it's in here. It might feel in the environment. And the habit of that takes on its own life after a certain point. At a certain point, all that narrative stuff it becomes, the belief in it diminishes. The thought that believes in it diminishes to an extent it can really be dropped. And when that happens, something else takes over, it seems. Something else kind of energetically directs what we would once have referred to as a practice. Or at least all I can say is that that's my interpretation of my experience with it. Because who knows, this could go anyway for anyone. So anything I say could be a lot of shite at the end of the day. So it becomes less about looking for something to avoid and accepting, noticing, realizing what's here, including the thoughts, including the emotions. And there's a once that narrative kind of calmed down, in my experience, let's say, there would kind of be like a I could maybe describe it as like an infinite potentiality of mind activity or thoughts, like a giant ocean in which the thoughts were like moving around. Like it's alive, it's alive as fuck. All the thoughts are moving around, and then one would come out and maybe almost form and then come back in and become, and when it's not coming out and then taking the attention away into a narrative taking form, you can appreciate the sheer infinite potentiality of the mind at rest, the knowingness that the mind comes from at rest, and it moves. It's like it's just aliveness, present aliveness. But I think what's important is to be clear on what is a thought and what is not a thought. And at a certain point, it might become clear that everything that we thought we knew was a thought. How deep the illusion goes. An illusion that has its own relative reality, but everything that we thought we knew was filtered through thought material. And if the thought itself, what are its qualities? It's transient. Seems like it comes and goes. It's kind of ghost-like, can't be found, mysterious. There's a kind of, the experience of a thought is very real, very non-dual. But when we give it life, when we adopt the position of which those thoughts refer to and focus it out onto an objective world, it takes on lifelike form that looks like what we think reality is. If that makes sense. It's but can you find a thought? Where does a thought seem to appear, and where does it come from? Where does it vanish into? Or is any of that really happening? Is it? There's a knowingness there that doesn't require thought. It doesn't require the movement of thought to understand. Because it is the knowingness that allows thoughts to know, to be known, to be experienced. It's kind of like the intellectual knowing of thought is borrowed by thought. Borrowed by what seems like the thought, the content of the thought. And we can kind of see that everything's a reflection. The mind's version of reality is a reflection of something, but it's not clear what that something is. So how can we ever believe in a thought? If it's a mysterious reflection of a mystery, an unknowable mystery, then the value of that as a truth kind of goes out the window. Anyway, I said this would be a long one, so that'll do for now. Talk to you next time.